There's a spirit that defines every Tasmanian. Fight, gravel rash grit, devil-like determination. It's time to unleash this spirit on the great game. Without our boots on hallowed grounds, the AFL will never be complete, nor will we.
Hello and welcome to The Believers, celebrating the many great Tasmanians who left a lasting impression on the national game, a game we hope will become truly national when Tasmania gets a men's and women's AFL licence in the near future. My guest today, well, there are few more loved football figures than Matthew Richardson. He played 282 games for the Tigers, kicked 800 goals, 464 of those coming at the home of football, the MCG. It is wonderful to have Richo on The Believers today. G'day, Richo.
Thanks, Al. Great to be here.
Now, it's about 30 years, I reckon, since as a young teenager you would have made your senior football debut for Devonport in the old State League. What do you remember about those early experiences playing against the men?
Yeah, great memories. Great memories. I can really look back fondly on that time. It was a really good competition, first and foremost, back then, the Tassie State League. And, you know, you had a lot of ex-VFL, AFL players coming down there to coach, and I had one of them myself in Peter Knights as my coach. But then you had, like, Rhys Jones, and you had Bob Keddy at South Melbourne, you had Mark Browning down in Hobart, Stevie Wright at Clarence. These guys were big-name VFL players, so they were attracted to come to Tassie to coach, and a lot of guys came down there to get redrafted or drafted, so it was a good competition. And firstly, for me, you know, as a young player, it was a great grounding to come across to play AFL footy because you're playing on men, you know, big men, tough big men, and I think that was a better, you know, experience for me than to play in, say, the under-18 competition, which they play in now, because you can't possibly be as well prepared. So, yeah, really good time. Peter Knights was, you know, a great coach for me, taught me professionalism from a young age, and he brought that across with him, and, you know, really was a good sounding board as to what I was going to come up against, I guess, in the AFL. So good times. As
a young, talented kid, obviously, with a future ahead of you at the higher level, I'd imagine you're a bit of a target out there on the field. There's no friendliness from some of the opposition's more senior players, but you had the likes of Shane and Brett Smith. You had Brett Jaffray, Chris Dell. Would have been there in your corner, I'd imagine. Yeah, the Jaffray brothers from Latrobe, Wayne Jaffray as well, who's a really good player. Rod McCormick was a good player at Devonport. Another guy that I'm still mates with now, you know, hear from occasionally on text, Dean Cullen, came across from Ulverston. He worked for my dad as a furniture removalist, but he's a tough player, Bull Cullen. He looked after me out on the ground. So, yeah, they were great guys to play with, but they were, you know, they weren't professional, but they took it seriously. It was a really good competition. So, yeah, it was a good time. I reckon in that era you would have had a few perhaps battles with guys like Darren Winterdale, Wish Wilson, those kind of players. Do you remember that? Yeah, I do. We played an elimination final against Clarence that year, and I played on Darren a couple of times, you know, through the season. Obviously, I also had Blair Brownless down there, who I played on at Clarence, but Winter was there. Then you had Mick Winter at Hobart, who was a really good player. Wish Wilson, as you mentioned, down at Burnie. These were tough guys. But I reckon the one I was really petrified of playing on one day at Boyer down there in New Norfolk, I got sent into the ruck by Peter Knights. I think Craig Hoyer, our ruckman, went off the ground injured for a bit of time, and I had to go into the ruck and try and run around with a guy called Mick Maple, who was just a ferocious-looking man. I was petrified of him. He had the big beard and the long mullet hairdo, but he was big. You know, he was a big, strong-looking guy, and I was about 85 kilos wringing wet then, so... Yeah, that was the day I never forget. Ben Harrison was playing in 92 with you as well, wasn't he? Yeah, he did. Yeah, Harrow had a really good year. I think he came into the team sort of probably about a quarter of the way through the season. Then we went away and missed a week with the Teal Cup. And he had an unbelievable Teal Cup, Harrow. And then he came back and played the rest of the year in the seniors at Devonport, and then Carlton drafted him at the end of that year. So we've been right through together. We played school footy at St Brendan's together, obviously Teal Cup together, senior footy at Devonport together.
Then he went to Carlton, but then we played at Richmond together. And now I live 150 metres from him in Northcote. So can't get away from each other, me and Harrow.
Now, we ask our guests to bring in something meaningful, something with a Tassie connection that's symbolic and means a lot to them. What have you brought in today, Richo?
Well, I see you got this State of Origin jumper here from 1993, and I was lucky enough to play in that game. We might get onto that later on, but the first thing I thought of when you asked me over the phone preparing for this podcast was this. This is my first Tasmanian jumper, and this is the State Under-16 schoolboys jumper. We went up to Brisbane in 1990 and played in the schoolboys. So that was my first ever Tasmanian rep jumper. So that means a lot to me. You know, your first state jumper means so much. And we're talking about this. I don't know why it's red.
The colours are different.
Yeah, so the tee is obviously red and the collar's red, the trim's red, which is different to that one there, the State of Origin jumper. I can't tell you why.
No.
I mean, the great historians of Tassie football will know why.
Someone will let us know.
So maybe the schoolboys was red as a point of difference. I'm not too sure.
Can you remember who was in your team?
Yeah, I can. A couple of guys from the west coast from Devonport were in that team. Guy Adam Richards, Brent Costello were guys that I went through the juniors with at Devonport. So there are a couple of names that I played with there.
Any others go on and play at the higher level?
Not at the highest level. A couple went on and played some statewide league footy down in Hobart, but no one that I think Johnny Devine's son was in that team. No, his youngest son was in that team. Not Mark Devine. I played against him as well. And a Palfreyman from Sandy Bay
Nigel.
played in that team.
He played at Fitzroy, actually. He did play a few games at Fitzroy and the Bears, Nigel Palfreyman. This State of Origin jumper, you're right, it is the 93. It's the last Tasmanian State of Origin jumper, and you were very young playing in that match. You'd been drafted at the end of 92, hadn't you? So 93 is your first season in the VFL or AFL at Richmond. I actually went down. My dad took my brothers and I down from Penguin, and we watched this game at Belrive Oval against the Northern Territory, Queensland. I reckon I was only 11 years old. The joint was packed.
It was packed.
Jason Dunstall turned it on that day, I
reckon he kicked 10 Dunstall that day. I mean,
was Alistair Lynch playing on him for a fair while?
Yeah, Lynchy wouldn't like me to say all day. He got pretty good service. Another guy who played at Carlton in the early mid-90s there, Tony Lynn, who was a Queenslander. I think Lenny had about 35 touches for them. He played a lot of good footy at Carlton, missed out in that 95 premiership team.
Did he end up at Port Adelaide, I think, in the
Tony
end as well?
Lynn, I'm not sure if he went to Port. But, he was a really good player for Queensland Northern Territory that day. Yeah, we got beaten pretty soundly. I'd only played 4 AFL games at that point, and Robert Shaw was our coach. I think you've had Shawry on this podcast. And he tore strips off us after the game. He was shattered, obviously a proud Tasmanian, and we didn't perform that day, and it was an almighty bake by Shaw. I remember I got back, and Mum and Dad came down from Devonport, and I went back up to Devonport that night and had a night and spent the day with them the next day, and then had to come home, obviously. But I just remember going home in the car. Shawry, I reckon he said after the game, some of you guys, you won't play again, I actually thought my AFL career was over. Driving back to Devonport, because I played poorly, and I ended up on the bench for a bit of that game, and I think, geez, I'm sure he's not right. I might never play again.
My most vivid memory of that match being a youngster is Matthew Phoebe taking one of the most extraordinary marks it would have been on the western wing, not far from the interchange?
Yeah, near the interchange benches, so the broadcast side of the ground. I was sitting on the bench when he took that mark, Matthew Phoebe. He sort of went up and twisted in the air and took it overhead. It was like he shouldn't have taken it. Yeah, it was an extraordinary mark. I reckon the footage on TV that I've seen of that mark doesn't do it justice. Sometimes the angle's not quite right or whatever. But being there on the day, it was a huge mark.
It was all we were talking about in the car trip home. We sort of had quickly moved on from the result, which I think was 7 goals or something like that. You touched on your dad. So your dad, you were a father-son at Richmond. Your dad played in the 1967 Premiership, one of the best players on the ground in that grand final. Very different style of footballer to you, is that right, Richo? Yeah. He was more of a stocky, strong-chested type ruck rover? Yeah,
he was 6 foot, Dad, but pretty heavy set. Ruck rover. Came down from Casterton up in, obviously, the Western District near the South Australian border, not far from Mount Gambier. So Dad came down to Richmond in 1959, played there for 10 years, then had a year at South Melbourne. We're recording this podcast in Albert Park, so I played at the Lakeside Oval there for a year with Bobby Skilton, and Peter Bedford would have been there. I think he played about 10 games at South that year in 1970, and then went over to Tassie to coach East Devonport in 1971. Arnold Richardson got him over there. Who was a long-time supporter of the East Devonport Footy Club, put a lot of money into the club, the grandstand. He basically built Girdleston Park, actually. So he got Dad across there in 1970, coached for 3 years, then went up to Mildura for a year to coach him, Irimple up there, but then came back to East and played his final season there. Wasn't coached that year. I'm not sure if Gypsy Lee might have been coach. Retired, but then stayed in Tassie. Loved Devonport, loved the lifestyle, got involved in a business there, the transport business, and stayed till the late 90s and then came back to Victoria once all us kids had grown up. But all us kids born and bred Tasmania.
Yeah, I think, did he go to South Melbourne for that season because Norm Smith was coaching there and he wanted to learn how to coach? That was a vision that he had. He wanted to become a senior coach? Yeah,
I think he always wanted to be a coach and was sort of probably knew his time was coming up as a player at Richmond. I think Mike Bowden had sort of probably taken his role as ruck rover. Similar player, Mike Bowden was a handball sort of player. So I went to South to get that experience and then obviously took some of those experiences down to Tassie.
And only planned to go there for a few years, didn't he? Yeah. But ended up staying a long time.
I think he signed the coaching contract for 2 years and maybe he was looking to come back to Victoria or whatever reason. But did go to Mildura for a year, but they missed Tassie. I think Mum really enjoyed the lifestyle there as well and couldn't wait to get back from Mildura. So went back and stayed till, as I said, I think they came back to Melbourne in about 99. My sister was in uni up in Canberra. My brother had finished year 12 at St Brendan's, and I think they just thought the job opportunities for him were a bit greater in Victoria. Otherwise, I think they would have stayed longer again, yeah.
And your dad went more into an administrative role at East Devonport after he finished playing, didn't he? So what sort of memories do you have of going around coastal footy grounds when you were a kid watching East Devonport play? Yeah,
loved it. Dad was he got involved in the media there. He was doing like a report on World of Sport up in Launceston on a Sunday. But he was president at East Devonport for a number of years as well. So, we spent a lot of time up at Girdleston Park when Dad was president, and it just, like all kids, in the change rooms before the game watching. These guys were like the guys you looked up to. You didn't, VFL was a world away, wasn't it, when you were watching the footy there. So, you'd watch guys like Bill Williams playing full forward, and then Chris Reynolds as well. Like, was another guy that I loved watching as the big forward. I'd do the scoreboard at Girdleston Park and just be running around there after the game, having a kick on the ground, waiting for Dad to finish up formalities, Al, which probably meant having a heap of beers, I'd say. Looking back now, I'm not sure what else he was doing there, but just he supported the club. He gave jobs to players at his business, transport business. A lot of the East Devonport boys worked for Dad, Ross Harris and Dean Cullen, who I mentioned before. And then when he wasn't president, when he was doing that little media role, just the memories of driving into all the grounds and pulling the car in. Dad would, sit in the car with the radio on, watching the game and doing his report. And I'd be sitting in the front seat with him. You probably had the VFL on the radio and, down to West Park or to Wynyard or to Latrobe, and most of those grounds you could drive into and park. So,
absolutely.
The tooting the horns when a goal was kicked.
Totally, mate. Every ground, wasn't it? You mentioned probably a few beers were being had off the field. Yeah. There were times when you'd go out into the huddle and see a few being had as well, weren't there?
Yeah, you could. I remember a day at Burnie, and it was Cooey playing, I reckon it was, and would have been the mid-'80s, I suppose. And Stephen Beaumont had been at Essendon and had come back, and he was a legend on the northwest coast, Stephen Beaumont. And I remember this one day out at the huddle and, the cordial would come out with the 20 cups of cordial, obviously. And there were this day at Cooey, there were 19 cups of cordial and a little pony of whatever the Bogue's Draft probably on the northwest coast. A little pony there, and I thought, who's that for? And it was for Bowie. Bowie had a little pony at quarter time. And I reckon he had a dart after the game too in the change rooms. But that was the northwest coast.
So you play your season in the State League in 1992 and then you go off to Richmond. You go to a club, obviously where your father has a legacy, but the club, when you arrive there, it's in disarray, really, isn't it? A lot of financial trouble.
Yeah.
What do you remember about the environment at Punt Road when you got there?
Yeah, look, I didn't know any different. The facilities were certainly pretty average, but, I didn't mean anything to me. I mean, I played at Devonport there. We had a few weights. We had a few weights at Richmond. It just was probably what was had. I didn't know any different. So coming from the change rooms from the Devonport Oval or Girdleston Park, where I played under 17s before I went to Devonport, the facilities weren't much better, but look, I just wanted to get over and play in the MCG, and that's where we played our games. So the facilities meant nothing to me. I was a pretty hard trainer. I enjoyed the training and the running that we did, and I didn't know any different. But, looking back now, the club wasn't in great shape financially. They'd just come off the Save Our Skins campaign where they pretty much needed $1 million to stay afloat, and they did it by rattling tins and having raffles and functions and sports nights all around.
Players were involved too, weren't they? Did you
Yeah,
have to do it?
I went to I actually, when that was on, which was before I got to Richmond, but we went to a function in Launceston actually, and Dad was invited along as a past player, and I remember them, selling raffle tickets there that night, and I think Neville Crowe came over, and there might have been a couple of other Richmond people there putting on a sports night in Launceston to raise money. So when I got to the club, they'd got through that period, so they survived, and they had a young CEO in Cameron Schwab, who was just taken over, and I didn't know any different though, as I said.
Yeah, were there any when you got there? Who were the players? Did you follow Richmond quite closely?
I did, I was mad Richmond. Yeah. So
who were you in awe of when you got to
Dale
Punt Road?
Waitman? Still there, the flea. So he ended up living about 200 metres from me out in Vermont South, and a couple of times there I got a ride into training with him. I'm like, wow. I ended up playing 6 or 7 games that year with Flea. It was his last year, and clearly he's an AFL Hall of Famer.
Absolutely.
And, a legend of our club. And I don't think anyone played better state footy than Dale Waitman.
My word.
For Victoria. So, he was one guy, obviously, I was in awe of. I loved Matty Knights. Jeff Hogg was my captain. He was the full forward, and I loved Hoggy sort of when I was 15, 16, watching him play. Richmond weren't a successful team, but I was passionately barracking for them.
Yeah. How'd you end up in South Vermont? That's a fair way away
Family
from
friends,
Road.
yeah.
Okay.
So another Tassie connection, actually. Mum and Dad's best friends were a couple called Jill and Bob Lucas, who lived in Devonport. Bob was Dad's reserves coach at East Devonport in the early 70s. They become good mates. Bob worked with Dad for a few years at Formby Removals in Devonport. They moved to Melbourne about 2 years before I did. Their son Simon was one of my best mates. So it was a natural thing for me when I moved to Melbourne. The club obviously asked Mum and Dad, how they wanted me to be boarded, I guess, with a guest family. And Mum said, well, the Lucas family are friends of ours. They've offered to, give Matthew their spare room, and I boarded out at their place. It was like being at home.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Like I spent every weekend with the Lucas family growing up. So, and Bob, mind you, was a William Leach medalist for Clarence, Bobby Lucas. So he's got a good football background. So, Bobby was, like a second dad to me, and a good footballer too.
Yeah, brilliant. And I'm sure that helps you settle in much more
I
easily.
did. I was like being at home, Al.
Going to North West Coast Tassie, moving to Melbourne, knowing you're going to play footy at the MCG and being in the hub of the game, that's a pretty big shift.
And I didn't. You talked about staying with the Lucas fan. Didn't have any homesickness at all.
Yeah.
I felt like I was at home with, the Lucases around me, so helped me settle in quickly.
Your debut, it's round 7 against St Kilda at the MCG in 1993. You did really well on debut. Do you have many memories about that day and how you felt and all the experience that went with it?
Yeah, well, I remember getting up in the morning out in Vermont, and Bobby Lucas said, "What do you want for breakfast?" He'd never cooked me breakfast before. He actually offered to cook me breakfast. He wanted to cook me steak and eggs, right? I said, "Bob, we don't have..."
That's what your dad would have had.
Yeah, they would, and everyone would have had it, so it wouldn't have mattered. I'm tipping if I had to run around with a big porterhouse in me steak guts that day, I wouldn't have done too well. So that was the first thing I remembered, and I remember sort of almost having a bit of a laugh, saying, "Oh, no, I don't think I'm going to have steak and eggs, Bob." But, yeah, getting into the ground and, watching the reserves play, which I loved. I loved getting there early and watching the twos. And then running out, I'll never forget running out down the race there in the old Northern Stand. We actually did run down the race onto the arena. First opponent ended up being Danny Frawley, who was Victorian, full back at the time. Played on Jamie Shanahan as well that day. We won. We sung the song. We only won 4 games that year, Richmond. So to have a win in my first game I played with Duncan Kellaway as his debut as well. So it was nice to have that memory with him. So yeah, good memories.
And you had a really good first season, didn't you? And you follow it up the following year. You're really starting to establish yourself in the competition. And then 95 rolls around and there's that awful incident at the SCG, which actually led to the ground dimensions being changed where you did your knee.
Yeah, that's true. People probably think, oh, really? Did that happen? I said, yeah, well, it did. Yeah, I remember going up for the mark right against the boundary line and I was in the air and Andrew Dunkley sort of put a bit of pressure on my back as you do as a defender, but that sort of catapulted me forward and I thought, I'm going to hit the fence here. So my immediate thought in my mind, and this is clear as day to me, is I've got to stop straight away. And you saw it on the weekend with Trent McKenzie, that hyperextension of the knee. That sort of same thing happened and I catapulted into the fence. That didn't cause the knee reconstruction, but the hyperextension did. And that week they actually brought the boundary line in. I don't know how far, but they did move it in. It was in the news. It was reported everywhere. So I remember I had calls and letters coming from left, right and centre from solicitors and lawyers, saying, that you've got a case probably here if your career ends up, not going where you want it to go.
For a second, did you even consider that?
No, because I was just young and just thought, no, I'm just going to get back and play. But probably looking back now, if I didn't come back, I would have had a pretty strong case, I'd say.
I think you really would have, wouldn't you? It cost you a finals series. You only got to play in one other final series, didn't you, which was 2001 when Richmond made the prelim as well. But 95 they made the prelim. And what was that experience like for you not being part of it? Yeah, looking back now, I just thought we'd play finals the next year and I'd be a part of it. We now know that doesn't happen in AFL footy. Never a guarantee to go on and do anything the next year, and we didn't. Look, we were okay into the next year. I think we finished probably 9th, I think, the next year, missed by percentage. Yep. So that was disappointing, and I only played one final series after that in 2001. So, it was disappointing in hindsight to have only played 3 finals and missed the only other final series we were involved in. How did Richmond miss the 8 in 1996 when you've come back from your injury? You've kicked 91 goals. That's an extraordinary comeback from such a serious injury. Yeah, look, I am proud of that now when you see how it can take guys a long time to get over knees. So, look, I did the work. I trained hard and our docs and physios did a really good job as well. How did we miss? A lot of different reasons. I think the coaching change, and this is to not be derogatory towards Robert Walls at all, who was our new coach. I loved Walls's coaching, but he was a different style coach to the coach that took us to the prelim final, John Northey. They had different philosophies on how they went about it, and I just think some of the guys that played really good footy under John in 1995 probably didn't play good footy the next year, and they were the reason we played finals, because you had guys, really bobbing up, and they were probably guys that were, say, 16 to 22 on your list. They played sort of out of their skin that year. Yeah. The next year, a lot of them didn't play that way and, in fact, didn't even play. So we then had new players coming in. The mix just wasn't quite there and just different style of coaches probably. How did you feel about the departure of John Northey at the time? Because you'd made a prelim final and then he's heading north. Yeah. As I was only 20, and I was worrying about getting over my knee more than anything. So probably didn't give it as much thought as some of the older players at the time, but it didn't seem right, did it? How can you play in a prelim? And the progression we were having under him, 4 wins, 12 wins, prelim final. We had 12 wins in his second year. It was a pretty good. So it was literally just that he was not going to get the tenure. Well, he wanted a contract extension. I think he already had a year to go, and for whatever reason, the board thought, no, we don't need to give you a new contract just yet. And then the Brisbane job came up and he wanted that. And then obviously the whole thing fell apart and he went to Brisbane, and Wolsey, who was the ex-Brisbane coach, came to Richmond. And it didn't work for whatever reason. What do you remember? I mean, Wolsey is revered by many, but also there's always the mention of just how fierce he was and how hard a taskmaster he was. What was he like at Richmond? Well, I think those words are correct. He was
a hard taskmaster. And John Northey would pump you up. Like, that was his style. He'd pump guys up, to make them feel like they were probably even better than what they were at times, But he kept doing it, and you could probably believe it after a while. And they're the guys that I said probably played better under Swooper, whereas Robert was hard on guys, and for whatever reason, a lot of guys didn't react to that. I didn't mind it. I'd liked a coach who could give it to me. It sort of fired me up, whereas other guys go into their shell. And he's a premiership coach, but for whatever reason, it was totally the opposite to what probably John Northey was, and it just didn't suit the group at the time.
You had 5 different senior coaches, didn't you, across the course of your career? When you reflect on it now, and we chat about the fact that you only had the opportunity, if you'd been fit, to play in 2 final series, was the unsettled nature of Richmond at the time, is that in any way, did that reflect in the performance, do you think?
Oh, look, I think so. I mean, it has to. I mean, you just get used to a certain way and a certain coaching style, and then it changes again, and then a new guy comes in with a whole different set of ideas and opinions on players and how we should play. I think, boards at footy clubs now have become more patient. A coach will get 5 years now. I reckon if you got 3 at the most, if you weren't winning by the end of the 3rd year, you're probably gone. And Richmond had that history of being impatient for success through the 80s and 90s. So I think up until 2000, so the period from sort of the end of Kevin Bartlett to Danny Frawley, they changed too regularly. But they probably wanted John Northey to stay, didn't they? Like, he could have been that coach, but he decided, in the end, Swooper did decide to go to Brisbane. So they're a bit unlucky with that one. Wellesley probably was coming to the other end of his career, where he probably would admit now he didn't even probably want to keep coaching when Richmond came, and then they convinced him. You'd have to check that 100% with him, but I feel that was what probably happened. Yep. And then they gave Frawley and Wallace 5 years each, so you can't complain with a 5-year reign, really, can you? So probably that period in the 90s, they were a bit impatient, but a bit unlucky too with the whole Northey thing.
I mentioned off the top you were a heart-on-your-sleeve type player. When you think back about your career, and there were moments where you were, I don't know, people suggested there was an element of petulance, and sometimes you'd give your teammates a spray that kind. Yeah, you agree?
Of course there was.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a bit of, you can throw it all into the pot, There was a bit of petulance, immaturity at times, but there was also a lot of, being hard on myself and wanting to perform to a really high level.
Passion.
Impatience, to want things to happen. Until I didn't really get a hold of all of that emotion until I was probably about 28, 29. Then I actually played the most consistent footy of my career until my end of my career. Because I handled those emotions better, tunnelled them in the right way. But, you can probably say for 11 or 12 years I never had a handle on it. So I really look back and go, gee, I wish I had got a hold of that earlier.
Where did it stem from, do you think? Was there a story about you in a high school game getting taken off the ground and going, bugger this, I'm going to the car, and your dad said to you, get back
That's
over
right.
there?
No, I always spat the dummy. Yeah, I was pretty impatient. Yeah, no, that day I gave away a 50 in a school game. I'm not proud of this, mind you, but you can have a laugh at it now. And the coach, Mr. Fracalossi, I remember his name clearly. He was our maths teacher, and he's just trying to help out by coaching the footy team. And he was doing the right thing, dragging me and just saying, you can't give away 50s. And I said, well, if you don't put me straight back on that, I'm not playing for the rest of the game. Because I thought I was the best player, and I probably was.
You were, yeah.
And so I took my boots off, and Dad was in the car, of course. He always sat in the car and watched. And I walked to the car, and I could see his head getting redder as the closer I got to the car. And I got to the car, and he said, what do you think you're doing? I said, I'm not playing the rest of the game. He said, get back round there now and apologise to your coach immediately and put your boots back on. And Dad wasn't a guy that ever told me off. He was a pretty placid sort of guy, Dad, as far as that stuff go. He let Mum tell us off. And I knew he was serious, so I went straight back round and apologised.
Well, along the way, were there times where you were pulled aside around that kind of stuff, Richard? Did people try and influence you?
Yeah.
Or did you just naturally evolve into
A lot of people tried to help along the way, teammates and people around the footy club, but it probably just got to a point where I just worked it out myself that I just had to change my ways, and that was, as I said, about age 28 or 29. I went and did a leadership course of my own bat, and it was a one-on-one type thing where I sat down with this particular person once a week on a Monday afternoon for hours and just talked about everything. And I didn't know why we were doing it for a lot of the time, but I think it sort of ended up working out how I wanted it to.
Yeah, nice. And I look at Jack Riewoldt in the early stages of his career, and I can almost see a few, just from a far-away observer, a few similarities with his passion and perhaps...
I think sometimes people do take it the wrong way. They don't realise that a lot of it is, harnessed in a good sort of direction, but it gets taken the wrong way at times.
Did you ever talk to Jack about his on-field behaviour early in his career?
No, not really. Because I'd only played a couple of years with him, and then I was injured in the last year, and Jack was only young at the time, and I just think you learn as you go along. So no, I didn't really. I'd have had a brief chat with him since then, but nothing in depth.
Yeah. And what about the footballer he's developed into? Did you know that he was going to become what he has? He's been an absolute champion like yourself.
You never know how good someone can be, but you knew he had all the ability in the world. He was a super junior player. I think he played in premierships when he was 15 at Clarence. I think guys that show that, you see Horn Francis on the weekend, he looked a ready-made player. He's played senior footy for a few years. Well, Jack was like that, right? Yep. He was a top first-round pick. You could see all the ability at training. You knew he could read the play quicker than anyone as a forward. And his ability to use his body in marking contests and his footy smarts for a key forward, I think, are the best in the game. So you could see all that. But you never know, they're going to play 300 games and kick over 700 goals.
Not quite 800, mate, and hasn't quite got you. He's probably 70 adrift at the MCG as well, which I'm sure will be important to you.
Yeah, I hope he doesn't catch me. No, I'm joking. I hope he does, because if he does, that means he's playing another few years. And
it'd be amazing
Richmond
if he could get there.
Need Jack out there.
2008, mate. Take me through that season where you finish runner-up in the Brownlow medal. You're playing on a wing predominantly. That is an amazing at that part of your career to play such a high level of football. You must be immensely proud of that.
Yeah, I am. I'm glad I was consistent towards the end. I didn't drop off the face of the earth, which can happen to players. I think Terry Wallace, his foresight to do that, and it was based around Jack Riewoldt getting more ball inside 50. He wanted Jack to be the man, and I was probably still demanding most of the ball down there. And it probably was going to hurt Jack a little bit, his development. And Terry said to me one day after round 2 or 3, he said, look, I've got to ask you a favour. And I thought, this mightn't be any good, I knew I wasn't playing that well as a forward. I'd actually lost a bit of pace. I couldn't get off my man inside 50, and I'd had a pretty average start to the year. And he said, what do you think about moving up to the wing? And I actually said, I don't think about moving up to the wing. I've never thought about it. And then he told me the reasons why, and then I came back with a counter-argument that why don't I play the bear in the square type role, and Jack could play that hit-up type role. And then Plough actually said, well, you can play for Coburg then. Basically said if I didn't play on the wing, I wasn't going to play.
Wow.
So, of course, I got up and played on the wing, and it ended up being a great coaching move by Terry, because it worked out well for me, and I think Jack probably developed quicker than what they thought he might at that stage. So, yeah, it worked out. It was a win-win for everyone.
Yeah, how quickly did you realise, hang on a minute, this actually suits me?
Pretty much the first game over against Freo at Subi, I lined up next to David Mundy at the centre bounce, and we shook hands. I didn't see him for the rest of the game. I thought, how good's this? In the forward line, you got someone with your arm against, and the first few balls that I got that day, I was out in space, and there wasn't as much pressure in the game in 2008 as there is in 2022. So when you got the ball, I looked up and had a bit of time and could run around and get a few uncontested possessions, which were hard to get inside 50. So I worked out pretty quick. It was a good move, yeah.
Yeah, wonderful career, Richo. 800 goals is an amazing feat. And what an honour to be the player that's kicked the most goals at the MCG, 282 games. We mentioned just the one finals series. Yep. Richmond got there, though, in 2017, and you were working for Channel 7 at the time, and you were given the great distinction of presenting the Premiership Cup as well. Did you realise that you were held in such high regard? Can you talk about what that day meant, what your experiences were on that day?
Yeah, first and foremost, I couldn't believe I was given the honour by the Richmond Footy Club, who have to nominate you to present the Cup that day, and I was a bit embarrassed about it when you look at Bartlett, and could have been Tony Jewell, the last premiership coach, or a Francis Burke or whoever. It could have been any one of those guys. And to be given that opportunity by the club board and Brendan Gale and Peggy was just unbelievable. So when it sunk in, and then to be out there on the day and standing out there when the anthem's being played, and yeah, it was just sort of surreal to be involved in. I didn't allow myself to think that it was actually going to happen because you didn't want to be disappointed. But as the day wore on, it became pretty clear they were going to win that game. I remember Timmy Watson, who I was sitting next to on the boundary for Channel 7, about halfway through the third quarter, he said, mate, you can relax. I reckon they've got it. And I looked at the scoreboard and it was about 8 points of difference. I said, what do you mean, Timmy? It's 8 points of difference. But if I hadn't have been a Richmond Nuffy, I would have been able to see momentum. And all the other games late in that year, they just had momentum. And they were just crushing teams late, and they were going to do the same thing that day, and they did. So, yeah, once I got up there and was presenting the cup and to hear the Richmond faithful, it was pretty special. Probably, your kids are obvious when they're born is unbelievable, but that day's pretty close to it. It's just unbelievable.
The emotion was so raw and so obvious on so many, including yourself. When did you really get struck by the emotion of it all? Was there a moment within the game?
It was when Dan Butler, I think they went to 42 points up, but it was 7 goals and there was 6 minutes or so. It could have been, don't quote me exactly on that. But on the boundary, they showed footage of Brendan Gale embracing Peggy and Michael, his brother was there, and his son Donovan. And you could tell they were upset, and that was in an ab break. And then I could feel it coming over me, the emotion. And then I thought of my dad. I thought, geez, Dad would have loved this. These latter years of his life, he just wanted to see Richmond win another flag.
Had he passed
So he passed in 2015. And I thought, geez, Dad, how much would he love this? And then I lost it. And, it was a great moment.
Yeah, they're beautiful scenes. And to think what Richmond's achieved now to go from that period where you arrived at the club and it was just, trying to survive, having raised $1 million to do it and having had limited success and getting to finals through the early 2013, 14, 15, that kind of thing, but never actually really being able to kick on. Then win 3 in 4 years. That's amazing.
Yeah, it is. And it's well documented now. And it's hard to win 1, let alone 3. So, incredible what they've been able to achieve. Yeah, that first one, I didn't see it coming. I don't think anyone did. So I actually, in my own mind, thought, I don't think Richmond will ever win. You didn't allow yourself to think about it. So, pretty lucky to have been involved in some small way and to just be able to watch it as a fan was pretty special.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's going to be really special if we see some sort of incarnation of this jumper in maybe 5-6 years' time in the AFL as well. How are you feeling about the prospect of a Tassie team now? To me, it seems like the right people have been behind the push. The business case has been demonstrated. They're going to build a $750 million stadium, for God's sake. So how could they possibly say no this time?
Well, that's how I'm feeling about it, Al. In the past, it didn't quite seem real enough, but now that this is the stadium, you can see what they're going to build, and the research has been done, and Colin Carter did all that research recently, and obviously the Tassie state government couldn't be behind it any more than what they are. They've just been sensational with the push and putting a bit of pressure on, I reckon, which probably needed. They need a nudge, I think, and I think it's just time. I mean, you can't have a truly national competition without Tasmania being a real part of it with their own team. No relocated teams, no teams playing games down there, their own new start-up team. And I think the timing is right. And then the other argument you hear is, there's not enough talent. Well, I just watched a few guys on the weekend that bobbed up out of nowhere and showed that the talent is there. I mean, Jack Hayes at St Kilda and young Martin at Essendon. I mean, they weren't on a list a month ago and they're starring in round 1. So I think if your recruiting's good enough, you can find enough talent. So I think the timing's there, Al.
Yeah, and there are many examples, aren't there, even over recent years where gems have been found. The likes of Tim Kelly, Marlon Pickett at Richmond, for example. They're there. Ian Callanan's a great Tasmanian story of someone who I think we all knew down there he was capable of playing AFL footy, but took a long, long time to get his chance.
And I think if they know there's another licence coming, the guys that don't get drafted initially, they won't go and play country footy or metro footy here in Melbourne. They might stick at it.
Yeah.
They might stick at it and not go and, find a career elsewhere because they know there might be a chance coming up. So
absolutely.
You mightn't lose talent, you might keep more talent.
Yeah. What do you think it would do for Tasmania generally to have that team? I mean, it's been I haven't lived there since 2011.
Yeah.
And the decline in Tassie football has been so alarming to see from afar. Do you think that could arrest that decline?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as I said, because guys might actually, if they don't get drafted initially or they're 15, 16 and there's other influences starting to come into their life and they get dragged away from footy, and you can see why. They may think it's not reachable, but if it's there in front of you and it's right in front of your face in your own team, I reckon it'll keep kids playing. It'll inspire kids to play. And, I think you'll find that there'll be a real shift in, Tasmanian footballers in the game again, because there's been a bit of a decline in numbers of players being drafted. So, yeah, I think if it's actually a Tasmanian team, it's in your face, it's in your own backyard, I think the talent will be there. The state's kicking goals. Every time I go home, I just go, gee, how good's Tassie going at the moment, with tourism and the amount of, things happening in the state now. It's a great place to visit, and this will just be another reason to go to Tassie. It'll be a great trip for Victorian and interstate teams to make it the trip, so it'll just boost the whole state.
Yeah, absolutely. I think people would target it because...
Yeah, it'll be the one you highlight, let's go to Hobart and watch our team.
There are so many reasons to go to Tasmania, but this adds another layer. Yeah. You go for Collingwood, you go for Essendon, we want to go down for the weekend. People who might not have been to Cradle Mountain, you can go on the ferry, you can go all around the state.
So there's a lot of good stuff around it.
It's a win-win-win. There are so many wins involved, Richo. Let's just hope it happens. I want to just ask you, though, when you look at this jumper, when you see the map and you see that jumper and those colours, how powerful is that symbol to you?
Oh, it's huge. I mean, as I said, the first thing I thought about when you said bring something from your footy time in Tassie, it's that jumper. It's the map of Tassie on the front, and it's, who knows what sort of jumper they'll come up with, but if it's got something like that on it, it'll look pretty good.
All right, mate. That's the hard stuff out of the way, or the long stuff out of the way, but I've got 10 quick Tassie questions for you that will fire off. And these, they're not easy. Some of them are tough. We've had people find a couple of them really challenging.
This might make me look stupid.
I think you are well. Well, you went on Wheel of Fortune one day, didn't you?
Sail of the Century.
Sail of the Century. How'd you go?
Billy Brownless got me, which is good.
Oh, no. How does Billy...
he just nailed Fast Money at the end. Go and have it. It's on YouTube. It's
of all the
funny.
Stories I've been told, Richo, sitting here in this podcast room,
I'd like my time again.
That is brilliant. Let's see how you go here. Who is the greatest footballer Tasmania has ever produced?
Oh, well, I'm going to say Darryl Baldock because Ian Stewart says Darryl Baldock. And if Ian Stewart says it's Darryl Baldock, I can't argue with that.
And East Devonport was where he started his career before he went to Latrobe, didn't he? What should the name of the Tasmanian AFL team be?
Oh, jeez. Oh, you got me on the spot there. Yeah, it's a tough one. Do you go the traditional route when it could be, and it's not going to be the Tigers? Is it the Devils? So it's been done before. Or do you come up with something totally new? I like the idea of just maybe handing it over to the Tasmanian people and doing it that way in a sort of democratic way and see what they come up with.
Yeah, I like it too. The Jack Jumpers was a good one.
Yeah, when I first heard it, I wasn't sure about it, but now I think it's great. And so they made the right decision.
Team colours, what should they be?
Yeah, I like the idea of it being based around this jumper here. Whether it's all green or it's all more yellow or whatever, but those three colours should be in it.
Who should be the inaugural coach?
Well, it might be Jack Rewalt.
There you go.
Yeah,
imagine Jack.
5 or 6 years' time.
Do you reckon he wants to coach? What do you reckon? Will he go media?
Well, he
will
looks
coach?
to be angling towards a media career, but I don't know. He's from Hobart. The team will be predominantly based from there, and he's a passionate Tasmanian.
My word, he's a passionate Tasmanian. Do you reckon he'd make a decent coach if he went down?
Well, he's got the best footy smarts of anyone if you watch the way he plays. So just whether you can translate. Coaches have got to be patient, though, I think. I don't know if Jack's patient enough.
He's matured like you.
He has matured a lot.
Who should the team play in its first AFL game?
Well, maybe Hawthorn, eh? Hand the baton over.
Yeah.
They've been there for a while.
Yeah, we were just borrowing you for a while, and now you can have your own team. I like that. What about the inaugural president?
Brendan Gale.
Yep, done. No worries. Sign here. Should the Tasmanian song be something new? I know you love your music as well, Richo. In the ilk of the Cat Empire, GWS, or something traditional like Tigerland?
No, I'm a traditional with those footy songs. I love the traditional tunes. So whether they can find an old traditional tune and get some good lyrics into it, I'd go that way.
All right. If Tasmania was to get free rein on one current player, let's just say the team was coming in tomorrow, Who would you love to see wearing the map of Tasmania?
It's a tough choice. Oh, look, I think Marcus Bontempelli, because he could be your captain. He's just got everything. Marcus, he's such a good person. He speaks so well, and his footy ability speaks for itself.
He's got the kind of character that could wear that jumper, hasn't he? Where would you recommend a tourist visit in Tasmania? Where's your go-to destination in Tassie? Must see.
Oh, look, I think it is down the east coast. You know, that down Frasernaid around Coles Bay there. It's just sensational around there, isn't it? So, yeah, probably there. But I mean, you go up the northwest coast of Tassie and get right up there. I mean, I've got to stay there, don't I? Go to Boat Harbour and sit on that white sand at Boat Harbour.
Oh, yes. Magic.
Hey?
Magic. I understand why you went for the East Coast. I was a little disappointed.
I didn't want to say. I wanted to say somewhere in Devonport. No, look, I think people wouldn't even know about Boat Harbour.
It's
probably,
magic, isn't it?
But
beach.
The white sand there. Go and sit on the beach there and have a picnic with your family.
Like it, Richo. The siren sounded. You're 5 points down. Which Tasmanian player, current or former, would you trust to take the winning shot at goal?
It's always Richmond with me, isn't it? I've gone Rewald, I've gone Gale, I'm going Michael Roach.
Ah, yes.
Disco Roach.
He's coming on the podcast too, Michael Roach.
One of the most beautiful-looking shots at goal you'll ever see, Disco Roach.
And yourself, how would you feel if, say, you had the Tasmanian jumper on in an AFL game and you were kicking after the siren to win? Where would you want? What meterage would you want, Richo?
I'd want probably 40 to 45 out on the slight angle because I'd have to kick through it then.
Matthew Richardson, are you a believer?
Yes, I am. Yeah, it's going to happen now.
Mate, fantastic chatting to you.
Thanks, Al.
Thanks for your time.
Pleasure.